So, like a good school teacher, before we start, in case you have the energy and you want to come in front, so we feel that the more people, it'll be great. For all those who can make a quick shift in front, thank you. I'm so sorry, I'm just taking an extra minute. It just feels a little more cozy. You feel like there are less empty chairs. So thank you, Mathrubhumi, for this brilliant session. We're looking forward to it. And as a storyteller, I think I'm going to delve into quickly asking the three of you what oral storytelling means to you from your context of where you come from, and anything that has moved you, that has stayed with you, that you think is very important, that you want to just set the ball rolling about. Oh, anybody, maybe we can start with you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so happy to be on this panel with Aleya and Mary, and thank you so much for the moderation. Um, for me, my storytelling started from the stories my great grandmother told me. I'm so lucky that I grew up, in my great grandmother's house, and she was a large figure. She was a mammoth. When she moved around rooms, you could tell that she was coming just by either the singing or the movement that we had. And so she would sit us down. We were about 30 great grandchildren that she had, and she would sit us down in the evenings. And this was in Kisumu, where I grew up, and she would tell us stories. And so for me, that was my first introduction to storytelling. And I always tell people that every story I tell now is a retelling of everything she told me growing up. And it's just a way of me expanding my imagination and thinking, okay, what if I could change this story that my great grandmother said and introduce a new subject or a new topic to it. And so that's really, I would say, oral storytelling is the foundation of all my storytelling.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And in fact, in the discussions that we were having, it could be a story, a lullaby, maybe a kitchen recipe that you're discussing, saying this is good. And I think for most of us, our foundations have been somewhere starting at home when it comes to oral storytelling. You, even in the context of history, I
Yes,
think if you can throw some light on
absolutely.
documenting
Yeah.
stories.
I mean, because I'm wearing two hats, as it were, a novelist and a historian. But I'll leave the novelist aside and I'll speak as a historian. And for me, rather than telling stories, I've been collecting stories as an oral historian and using those stories to throw light on the lives of other people. I mean, it started in a very remote rural village in East Anglia in England, and I was documenting the women's stories. And every time I went to interview someone, they would say, "Why are you talking to me? You should talk to my husband. He knows about the old days." And I would be saying, "No, no, no, no. I know he does, but I want you to tell me about your experience as well." And of course, it was a very, very different experience because these women helped the families survive, they helped the communities survive, and the stories that they told of the poverty that they endured. I mean, some of them were born in the 19th century, because I'm very old and this book came out quite a long time ago. But they were, documenting the poverty, the rural poverty that lasted really right up to the 1950s and the 1960s. So the stories they told were moving and profound, and they had to be retold. And subsequently, I worked on the Caribbean, and again, it was the same kind of um, stories that were told of growing up in the Caribbean and living through British colonial rule or misrule, the stories they told as migrants, which were important and vibrant and stick with me still. And those are the stories that I really think we needed to tell to bring in that kind of diversity of voice.
Before I give the mic to you, um, there's a very interesting point that you made about, women saying that, don't ask me my stories, my husband would know that better. So with your line of work as well, I just want to throw in, other than the fact that what does oral storytelling mean to you, why should women narratives? Because you just did a session with the little ones about a woman hero, which is so beautiful. So why do you feel that women narratives should also be constantly talked about, should find their spaces?
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here on this panel. And so thank you for welcoming us to your beautiful home. My work, in this moment, I'll put on my South Asian hat, which is to say that my ancestors, my great grandparents would have come down from India to Kenya. And the circumstances that they came down on were essentially they were economic migrants. And, you know, when they arrived into Kenya, they arrived under a very heavy colonial rule. A lot of the men died quite young. There's an image I have of my great grandfather when he first arrived, where he was sort of this young, hopeful, cheerful man. And then the second image I have of him, he's broken. It's just this look in his eyes that is just haunted. But I don't know what happened in the years between when he arrived and the year when that second image was taken. And so what happened is that we lost a lot of our stories, my community. We lost them on the journey, on the dhows, we lost them when, you know, a lot of the men died quite young and the women were left to take care of very young children. And when you kind of go into survival mode, I think a lot of times you just think about moving on and not looking back. And, you know, so I think I feel very much like there's a fracture in my own history. And lately I've been really thinking about where stories exist beyond language. So I've been thinking about how even if we don't have the words, that melodies carry story, you know, ragas carry story. The body, obviously, we know carries story, but so do recipes, so do superstitions. When you, yeah, when you're a population that's on the move or a community that's on the move, you tend to carry the things that don't take up space, superstitions and rituals and memories. And so, you know, I'm not intimate with my oral storytelling tradition in that way from my South Asian tradition. But as a performer, I've really learned from the Kenyan oral performing tradition. And that's where I claim now my storytelling lineage. That's what I've learned from and practice. And I think what's really beautiful about that is it's a very communal experience. Nobody owns the story. The story is owned by the community, and it's also owned by the people in that moment. So we create this experience together and we shape it as co-conspirators in that moment. I mean, women's stories, I think what's kind of cool about oral storytelling is that you can be very subversive because it isn't recorded in the same ways. So you can say things that otherwise would be challenging or dangerous to say. I think also you can transform the story based on the audience. And let's face it, the printed form has been gatekept by mostly white men, you know, and so the only way to keep your stories alive was, you know, as women, to keep them alive in your mouths and the mouths of your children. And, you know, when you're massaging them, when you're cooking, to slip in the messages that otherwise you need them to understand, but you need them to understand in a way that it's dangerous if you were to tell them any other hauli. Such a Kenyan way to say it, any other hauli, but I hope that answers your question.
Like a part of Indian tradition, where I come from in Gujarat, once a year they make masalas. They store them. So when they sit to make the masalas, the spice, their eyes are watering, but they're singing songs and they're telling each other secrets of, hey, if you get married, this is something you shouldn't do and you shouldn't sleep with your husband on the first night. Really? Yeah. Why? Because apparently the whole suspense and temptation of sex should be there. I'm not sure if they listen to it, but then this is great kind of, you know, passing on from one while they are standing for hours with that huge thing and grinding the masalas, you know. So I think it's just so beautifully put by you that, you know, these are spaces where women narratives are important. So my next question or sort of observation, and this comes from a place as a very angry mother to a 10-year-old, and I did speak to her about it. stories, books, or even the tradition of oral storytelling is something I am finding dying. If I may sound very harsh and rude, I apologize. Because children here, the only definition of story now is the Instagram story. That's the story that I understand. What is happening to my oral storytelling, techniques, methods? So, where are you seeing this go? Maybe specifically in general as well, but from where you come from, because it'll be very interesting for our audience to understand uh, what it is like there. Because clearly, many of us, right, we are like oral storytelling. Nah, I just go watch something on Instagram for hours. So it's pretty much a tradition that there's no documentation, there's not much work done on it, and I think it's definitely a dying form of passing on tradition and culture. So I'd love to know your take on this. And also, you throw in your bit as a historian anytime. Yeah. You wear whatever hat. Anyone, anyone.
Right. Okay. Yes, it is working. Um, I mean, like you, I despair about Instagram, but, you know, storytelling patterns change hugely, and, maybe they are still, they're inventing new ways of storytelling. But wearing my historian's hat, and when Aleya was talking about the lost stories, and, when I was working in the Caribbean, and of course, many of the stories, got lost in the Middle Passage, but some of them survived. The folk stories, the Anansi stories, and so forth. And there is a still very vibrant oral storytelling tradition in the Caribbean, in Jamaica in particular. But when I was interviewing, and I interviewed across generations, and there were certain things that struck me. So, although perhaps the stories had changed, the structures remained and the conventions remained. And into that, you could then read a great deal more than what was actually being said. And if I can just give one very quick example, time and again, every person I spoke to talked about their childhood in their rural villages, because the Caribbean was rural, and they would say how they couldn't step out of line, because if they didn't say good morning to someone, by the time they got home, their mother would know and they would get a lashing. That everybody was included in family. They called all the older people grandma or auntie. So the terms of address, everything was very, very inclusive and supportive. And I would hear this over and over and over again. And I thought, well, is this true? Was there no dissent in this village? Was nobody kind of marginalized? Was nobody excluded? And according to these narratives, no. I mean, it was always harmonious. And then I thought about the meaning of it. And I wrote a sort of long article about it called Praise Songs of the Family. And there were other kind of tropes as well that would be repeated over and over again. There was a very spiritual trope as well. And what was being done was, on the one hand, tracing a lineage in a very subtle way. And these things, of course, arose out of slavery in defense of themselves against that barbaric system and against subsequently colonial authorities. And they were prescriptions. They weren't necessarily descriptions, but they were prescriptions for how you should live. And, once you begin to look at the structures, then I think you can also see the hidden stories.
Yeah, I don't think oral storytelling is dying at all. I think, if anything, it's getting bigger. where we no longer can converge around the fireplace. We converge around YouTube, and we converge around TikTok, and we access stories from people who come on TikTok, and in 2 minutes they tell you, "Oh, my grandmother told me that if you do this and this and this," and we all lean in and we all listen and we all spend the next 2 minutes with this person's grandmother or their great grandmother or their traditions from whichever part of the country or whichever part of the world they're in. I feel like TikTok has allowed me to access cultures and oral stories that I would have never been able to access. For example, I live in London now, and there's so much of my culture that exists on YouTube that every evening, like if I don't know anything and I call my mom and I'm like, "Hey mom, I'm working on a short story and I don't understand this," and she's like, "Why don't you call your grandmother?" And I'm like, "Well, I can't bother my grandmother right now. I'm just gonna go on YouTube and I'll find some old person who was recorded on a very low quality 240p 480p video who narrates the history of the Luo or some very cultural event that I can still be able to access." So I think it's great that it's being documented now. I think what is happening is there is more corroboration rather than distortion. So the stories are kind of being aligned rather than before. You had your own story, someone had their own story, someone had a version. It will be the same story, but the version their great grandmother or their great grandparent had told them will be different. And so what social media or what popular media is doing now is we all have to align our story and we all have to accept the most popular version as the true version. I will come with my story and Aleya comes with her own story and she will say, "No, but that's not how I remember it," or "That's not how it was told." And before it was fine because that we relied on that distortion. The distortion was part of storytelling. The distortion allowed us space to add our own stories. But now when we corroborate them and we say, "Okay, I'm Luo, someone else is Luo, someone else is from this community," and our stories don't align, then we cannot narrate it on the national or international platform. We have to align them first. And I feel like that is what we are losing, that corroboration, because even now, when people put stories online, people will come and say, "No, but that's not how it happened." That's not. But it's like, no, that's not your story. That's not your version to do. I incorporate a lot of orality in my work, all my storytelling, and I ensure that I incorporate elements of orality. It can just be like in the middle of a story, you have a character saying, "Let me tell you something." That's a very oral way of coming into the story. Or, "Look, this is what I'm saying." That is a very way, or that's a very proper way of incorporating orality into your story. And I think, we have to look at what are the current movements and what are the poetics, what are the orality, what are the linguistic elements that we are bringing into our work, and what are the ways that we are preserving, oral storytelling rather than just saying, "Oh, it's dying." Yeah.
So before I give this to you, maybe you can throw, and if you want to add to this, Troy, is why do we need to have a single version? Why can there not be different versions? Why should my story as a Gujarati, half Tamilian, living in Gujarat, be similar to another Tamilian living in Gujarat? Maybe it is different stories, and shouldn't we be? Yeah, I understand the platforms are there, so maybe sitting in Kerala, someone can hear my story. But why do I need to align, is what I want to ask you. This comes from a performer's angst towards the fact that, hey, and sorry, I'm just taking a minute more and I'll give this to you. I feel right now, without being too vocal, because all these sessions are being recorded, the biggest problem in our country is we're trying to align a mythology and we make it seem like religion right now. So if your God is not my God, then one of us is wrong and one of us is evil here. So for me, the question therefore is, why? Why not? This is my Sita, that's your Sita, and hey, that's cool. Sorry, he's a passionate performer, and this has been such a. I've been in trouble because of this. Sorry, over to you. Same thing for you as well. I would like to know, because I suddenly discovered that she has a Gujarat connection. I'm very happy to hear that. And what does this mean to you? Yeah, right. This whole thing, and also if you feel that eh, this whole new digital space, and you need to have one version of the same thing.
Many questions. I mean, I'm surprised that there is a question around why a line, right? I think Actually, the most delicious thing about stories is that they are all different, that you can tell the story. I mean, how many times has Hollywood told the story of, right, of World War One, and yet how many times can you keep telling it and it feels different? I think you can tell the same story in infinite number of ways based on the perspective, based on who it's being told for and how. And I think part of our job as storytellers is to be faithful and true to the idea that of honoring complexity, of saying that the story does not need to be flattened into one version. And I guess that's why the theme, right, of this being plurality. Um, I had a thought and it's just disappeared, like fluttered away. In terms of the story about the question around the digital angle, so as a performer, I work essentially, and of course, I think you'll resonate. Is performance is about energy, and it's just, the moment you put a group of people together in one room and you're all sharing an experience of a story together, there's an intangible power to it that absolutely cannot compare, to experiencing the story in a digital space. I have no fear whatsoever that oral storytelling is going to die. I think even with children, you put them there together and they're mesmerized. I do think the digital, like Troy said, that there's some really wonderful opportunities for these stories to live beyond the present, in the moment space. So I think, again, like with performance theater, it's so transient. If you aren't present in that moment, in that specific place, the story just disappears. We do, so if I can, we do this Cabrazen, a little plug. Brazen means, well, you know what brazen means, and Ka means small. It's a podcast that I've been a co-creator on, telling the stories of brazen African women reimagined for little ones. And really, the reason that we chose podcast as a form is one, that we can reach children around the world with these stories that we think are really important to tell. And if we were to physically go from space to space, it would be impossible to reach all the kids. Secondly, it's difficult for these children at the age of 4, it's impossible for them to read the story themselves. And we think these are stories that are very important for them to grow up with. So oral storytelling becomes a crucial device. And whilst their parents are cooking or washing or cleaning, they can play the story, and, there's a form of sort of conscious entertainment, I think, that is available, that I think actually is really powerful as a form. Yeah.
Sorry, you want to?
I was just gonna say that one of my favorite forms of storytelling that is so underrated is gossip. And the way gossip carries stories over years and years and thousands of years, and it stays in families, and you carry it and you take it to another family, and when the daughter is married off to another family, they carry all this gossip that the mother. And I'm just like, why do we not look at that as oral storytelling? Like, there's so much room and there's so much play and there's so much. And throughout generations, women have been able to save other women through gossip. Men have been able to warn other men through gossip. And we just don't look at it as something. We don't give it the same value as people sitting around and listening to a story. And I'm just like, I'm working on a novel currently that's narrated through gossip, and it takes place in a family over 100 years. And it's basically, how do we carry secrets as a family through gossip, and how do we just allow this gossip to exist, and how do we allow distortion to happen but also accept that distortion as part of our history. And so for me, I'm just like, we need to talk more about the role of gossip in oral storytelling, and also just advance gossip as an acceptable form of storytelling. We need to strip the shame away, and kind of like, if you are a village gossip, you should be given the same weight as the village orator, or the village, or the town, the person who walks around with a horn announcing things. We should be able to say, oh, so and so, he comes from a lineage of village gossips, and basically they just carry gossip throughout the entire. And I think we should just be careful of the harm But apart from the harm that, if someone says a lie or something, apart from that, I just don't feel like, we give gossip the respect that it deserves.
No, I think we all agree because for us, it's not just stress relief, both as men and women. Sorry, you had something to say, Ali, because then I have a question for her.
I mean, I think part of what keeps gossip protected is because it's not valued in that way. I think that's what, because it's, the moment it's valued and seen as potentially dangerous, then it starts being policed. But I also wonder if there's a gendered aspect to that. Because women certainly value gossip as a form of storytelling. It keeps us safe. And it's dismissed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And is your mic working? Do you want this one?
Carry on.
Yeah.
I've interrupted you. Okay.
So I even when I asked her this question in the lounge, it excited me so much. Just asking the question is fun. For all the work that you've done, collecting stories, stories from women and men, and now that we're talking about gossip, as a historian, as someone who's written so many books on women, when women together talk, do they talk different? And when men talk together, is that different? And what is the difference between, because otherwise that's what happens. 3 women talking together, they're gossiping. 4 men, oh my God, something is going to happen to the economy, and now there's going to be something big there, right?
Yeah.
So would love to know your take on this.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think those narratives are very, very gendered. And women's gossip is dismissed, or women's talking is dismissed as gossip. Whereas you say men's is taken absolutely seriously. And I mean, I could go on about this, but I mean, let me give you a kind of proper historical example, and then I'll talk about my own experience. But one of the things that I observed very closely, particularly when I was collecting stories about migration, was the very clear gender divide about how they talked about it. And the men all said, and it kind of echoed these kind of Anansi stories. And if you're not familiar with Anansi, he was a kind of a trickster spider who would get himself into the most ridiculous situations and somehow always escape from them. I mean, I'm simplifying hugely, but but invariably I'd ask the men, and they'd say, well, we were just talking. We thought, hey, why don't we go to England? So, off we went, and we got our ping pong, which is the passport photo, and we got our, and, in a week we were on the boat, and, and of course they were getting themselves into all sorts of scrapes, but somehow they managed to get out of it. But it was, there was always, they were by themselves, it was spontaneous. You talk to the women, and they say, well, I thought about it, and then I thought, well, I've got to leave my children behind, and can I leave my children behind? And, well, I've got to leave my family behind, and will my mother look after them? And, and there was a whole deliberative structure. And then they would say, and I got on the boat, and I wept every day for 2 weeks. And it was such a sort of different way of actually framing that narrative. That it was remarkable. So that's the kind of the academic frame, if you like. But Preeti and I were talking because I was saying, when I talk with my women friends, and we're gossiping, and we're chatting, and it's like a kind of labyrinth. We move seamlessly from talking about politics or talking about literature, talking about the sizes or the most comfortable bra to get, talking about the fact that none of us can sleep properly at night, talking about recipes, talking about health, talking about our children, going back to history. I mean, we go in and out and up and down, and I describe this in a novel I've just written, which isn't yet published, and how the men seem to be like a Thames barge, a flat-bottom barge, and they just carry on the surface, and they don't seem to dip down and up and come and go and so on. But that is, maybe that's just my experience. But family gossip is wonderful, and I'll just end on this, that one of the inspirations for my debut novel, The Dressmaker of Dachau, was an aunt of mine who ran off. And uh, she was really never spoken of again, except in hushed circles. And, the kitchen door would shut. And I would hear, one relative say to another one, "Have you heard about Ada?" And, we children were not supposed to know about it. Of course, we were all like this, but those secrets, as well as the gossip, are also what make us.
I want to ask Troy about what it's like. I mean, the description of how men talk when they're on their own. I'd love to know how you would describe it. From a writer's point, you're a writer. I'm curious. Yes, I mean, let's have many stories.
I think it varies. I think it depends on class, race. There is variations. When you speak, for example, with queer men, they have very different interests. There are some who are just so steeped in fashion and pop culture, and what is Lady Gaga doing and what is Beyonce doing and blah 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 blah. And then you have those who are just deeply philosophical. But I will say that it always revolves around the same topics after a while. so once this is your group of friends who you just talk about sports and everything with, that's it. There is depth to it, as people will, as opposed to what you were saying. There is so much depth to it. You just have to distill through all the inane things that they say to be able to find the depth. Whereas when I speak with women, the depth comes really at the forefront. There's so much like, oh, so what are you doing, how are you doing it. But when you talk to your friends and and you're like, oh, I'm doing this, they're like, safe, bro. And it's like, okay, I respect that, but it's like I would want some interrogation into what I'm doing. So I cannot speak for all men as well. I have a very individual experience of manhood that is just very specific to me and my interactions with the men I've had. So I cannot speak, for example, for right now there's African Cup of Nations going on, and I have no idea what that is about. But then there are topics that I will speak about that I will have more depth with and I will have more insight into as a man.
While I do have questions and I'm going to come back, I don't like waiting for the last 15 minutes to throw it open. Anyone, any questions? Yes, sir. But after that, ask mine as well. So that there's this constant, yeah, 15 minutes, then you have to finish and leave. It's not fun.
Yeah, stories were really fascinating. See, while I was, especially in my case, while I was a kid, we used to read this kind of stories, especially from from Russian stories, from stories from Ireland, Irish stories. They were really fascinating, and yeah, I understand that this kind of stories will help us enlarge our imagination and will help us to become a good individual to behave in this society. But now, the question I would like to ask is to Madam Mary Mogabi, that is, how do you go about collecting stories as a historian? Whether whether it is a difficult thing or an easy thing, or tell me about your experiences while collecting these stories. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, it's you need to find, first of all, the people that you are going to talk to. And so, I would go both in the Caribbean and in England to what I call the gatekeepers. Those in the village who appear to be important people who can introduce me to others. And then the whole thing snowballs. So, they'll say, okay, but why don't you talk to my sister? Or why don't you talk to my aunt? Or, whatever. And, as I was doing it as an academic, then I would monitor it for, for representation, so that I don't have a complete monoculture, but there are across the range of class. I mean, when I was working on families in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, for instance, we made sure that we got Indo-Caribbean families as well as Afro-Caribbean families and so forth. So that's that was the kind of selection process. But interviewing, I've always used what I call the life story interview. So I don't just go in and say, tell me, tell me what your father did. Tell me what you did. I try and build up a picture and say, well, talk to me about your mother or your father, your grandfather, so that you get a picture of the family. And then, this takes several hours, sometimes days, going through childhood, what the education was like, who they played with, who they were friends with, who they were told not to associate with. So this wonderful myth about the harmonious village. Of course, the moment they say, well, we were always told we shouldn't actually play, with those children, it all breaks down. Whether the grown-ups played with them. We're looking at parenting. And then, so on like that, throughout the course of their life, so that you build up a picture, a whole picture. So that's how it was done. And, the interviews were all recorded. They are now archived. A lot of them are in the British Library. So, if you want to, I'm afraid you have to go to Britain for it, but some of them I think are digitized and online. But that was how I went about it.
And for us as performers, getting access to such stories is often difficult, right? Because you also collect, if I may. So if you also want to add your bit in the context of so many, yeah. We'll get you.
So the context very specifically that I work with is, again, life stories, but specifically of African women, both historical and present. And one of the challenges that we face is that a lot of the resource that you find, so for example, Mekatilili Wamenza was, one of our revered freedom fighters who led, one of the successful uprisings against the colonialists in the 1800s. And she was imprisoned twice. And at the age of 70, she escaped prison twice and walked over 1,000 kilometers to get home. It's extraordinary. The challenge is most of the records that you find about her life that are written, that are easily publicly available on the free archive, are written by, essentially the colonizer. And so not only is the gaze, oppressive, it's also very heavily gendered and doesn't reflect the kind of story that we're interested in telling. So what we have to do then is we have to we use both fact but also imagination. So we rely on our lived experiences as African women to really kind of embody what that must feel like and what must have been like, and tell the story. So for the children's stories, we reimagine them as myths, taking the license, so the colonizers become gigantic frogs that are stealing the songs and dances. Taking that sort of license enables us to find the essence of the story when sometimes the biography of it. So we're faithful to the truth, but not necessarily the facts. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. Do you have the mic? No, you don't, of course. Okay, you promise we'll get there.
Interesting about the gossip as a art form. Well, I'm from Nepal, and the Bay is called a very famous poet, Bhupi Sherchand, said Nepal is a country of rumors and gossip, and that's not an abuse, because in the totalitarian kingdom where they're ruled by a despot, so these kind of gossips generated. In fact, in Nepal, if like you break a utensil or something like, it's your duty to spread a rumor, to ward off the evil. It's more of a religious thing. But I think it's the whole paper. And then one of my friends said, spread a rumor that he's trying to marry your daughter after you. Which is crazy. It's like you're putting this woman at stake to avoid your prestige. So it's a kind of, I think the basic is the slander and the harm involved in gossip is more dangerous. And it's to men also in Nepal. Even men gossip. And I like about the queen that she has a Swiss account, or the president has this, she's having an affair with this general. So it's not just a story. I think it's a lot of harm in this.
And a lot of policing.
I think all storytelling has the possibility of harm, whether it's written or it's oral. It's what you do with it. You know, it's a very powerful tool. And when you're given that kind of power, when you're given the power to conjure worlds and to create human beings from nothing, like we were doing AI before AI became a thing, you know? So when you're given that kind of power, it also comes with a great responsibility. As a storyteller, what kind of stories are you putting out there? What do you want people to know? What are you preserving? What are you archiving? You know, do you want people to remember this story factually, or do you want people to remember this story truthfully? And I think that fidelity and that integrity to the story is what you must have as a storyteller. You're given a responsibility. You know, in the traditional African society, storytellers, rainmakers, medicine men, and seers were almost given the same rank, right below the chiefs and the kings. So if you have that kind of power, what do you do with it? And so whether it's gossip, or whether it's a newspaper column, or whether it's a 1,000-page novel, it could be harmful, but it could also be good. So it's upon you as the storyteller, as the person who's been given this responsibility and this power, to kind of use it well. Yeah.
And of course, we are a brilliant example because we are completely running on a PR machinery full of stories of crocodiles being fought when people were children. Yeah. For those who get it, they get it.
Hi, thank you again for such a lovely panel and for all the answers that we've been getting. I'm somebody who works at an organization that actively focuses on storytelling to get to children, to help them understand the importance of words and stories and communication. And so, the one question that we have always struggled with is how do we make sure that we are representing the voice, all kinds of voices, culturally, historically, in the right way, especially when we're talking to children? Because the matter of representation, tokenization is very heavy in media nowadays. So, as storytellers, how do we take that responsibility and accountability when we are representing voices that are not our own? So, if I could have answers on that.
I think just the fact that you're asking that question to start with is really kind of, you're on the right path. And thank you for asking it, because it's a question that I have to regularly ask myself in the work that I do as well. And I think the truth is that there are some stories that are not yours to tell. And then the question becomes, if you think that there's stories that are important to tell, who is the right person to tell that story, and how do you ensure that that story gets told and reaches the people that you want the story to reach? And a lot of the times that looks like literally using the privilege that you have, whether it's the resource or the time, to find ways to bring those stories to who you want to have them listen to. And I think there's a lot of people who, there's a lot of this like sort of fear in the literary world around, oh, we can't write anything, like you'll be cancelled, whatever. I think if you're gonna cause harm, as Troy said, stories are very powerful. I think there's a way, if this is something you're concerned about, there's a way to make sure or to check, right? And if you are unconcerned about it, then you will continue doing the work that you do regardless of how it manifests in the world. But in this interconnected space, so one of the things we do with Cabrés in the podcast is we really try to get kind of sensitivity listeners to listen to the podcast and tell us, where are the blind spots, where are there things that we're doing that we need to revise, we need to relook at. There are stories we cannot tell because they're not our stories. So we're looking for the people who can tell them appropriately. Yeah, that's...
So, as a performer, I think it's very heartwarming to see people do storytelling for children, because I'm the only one doing this in Gujarat. And I think what I mean, and she summed it up beautifully. I'm not going to repeat, but maybe a tip that I've been working on is I try combining the state's food for love for food. I am so sorry, with empathy with caste, which is very difficult. But I try to bring in a food which is, you know how we are, right? Even certain foods is, oh my God, I can't eat it, right? How you bring that story and therefore create an awareness that, hey, there is a beautiful reason why a certain kind of food has been cooked, why it is recycled. And that's when you talk about the fact that, hey, they don't have money. What does that mean? Right? So, in fact, I'm just going to take a second to advertise. I'm doing this day after. Please come if you have time with 4-year-olds with a lot of food that's coming from Gujarat. So, you want to take a look? Please come. And I would love to have you there. Help me out. Sorry, Troy.
Just to add on to that, it's good that you have this noble idea of giving voices to stories. But one of my favorite quotes is by Arundhati Roy that says, there's no one who is voiceless. There's either the silenced or the preferably unheard. And so whenever you think you're giving someone the voice, you have to ask yourself, are you taking up the space that they could take themselves and tell the stories directly to the people, or are you just deliberately ignoring them and thinking, oh my God, I'm giving this person this voice? So it's always good when we come as storytellers and we say, oh my God, I want to tell the story of the people of Kerala. But before you do that, can the people of Kerala speak for themselves? If you step away and allow them to tell their own stories, then people get the best perspective of the stories that they can tell, rather than you coming, as an outsider and saying, oh, let me tell the story of the people of Kerala. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
shall I-
sorry. I'm
2 seconds. I'll be very, very quick.
No, no, no. It's okay. Take your time. We have time.
In some ways, I'm kind of the obvious one. I'm white and I'm interviewing Black Caribbeans, and it's at the time I was doing it 20, 30 years ago. This that it wasn't an issue at all. But I always was very careful to say I was a Caribbean historian. I was not a Black historian. Now I think it's much more problematic, and but equally, the field has moved on, and there are now Caribbean historians using the same methods, so the story is being told. But oddly enough, I was kind of not quite cancelled, but the last novel that I published had initially a Black protagonist, and I was warned, absolutely do not go there. I mean, I protested and never mind my arguments, but there is, I can see the argument that I'm a white privileged person. So, why should I take other people's voices away? And I absolutely get that. I have done it. I hope I haven't done it, if you see what I mean. But I know, but we were very careful to be absolutely sure that we got permission, that we explained exactly what was going to happen to it, that the memories would be archived, that, this would be a publication. Were they happy with it? I mean, I think, we did as much as we could.
Also, as a journalist, when I was writing constantly on Dalit issues, the first thing I was asked is, why you? Are you a Dalit? Though I don't choose to answer that. But at one point, I remember my editor telling me something that sometimes that is a story waiting to happen. Write it, talk about it, and then let the community take charge of it. Because maybe they're so oppressed that they're not in a space where they can even stand up and tell their stories, So be that first person and then let them sort of give them that space, that opening. Sorry, ma'am.
Hi, I'll just take on, it's not really a question, rather a comment on what Troy said about gossip.
We all love gossip, right?
I couldn't help myself, but I had to say this. So I read this book. It was written by Meredith Abarca. She's a Mexican PhD student at that time. And she has documented kitchen gossip. The context was about cooking, where we usually, in the normative sense, we think of cooking as a patriarchal device, where women are oppressed to do household chores. But she has argued against it, saying that cooking for Mexican women is a form of agency. And and her methodology has been through documenting kitchen gossip. And that is brilliant because, and through that, I mean, I have, you can read academic journals, novels, so many things, but the day-to-day gossip happening in a scholar's house where the community, and they run a community kitchen and the women come and gossip, you get to know how gendered society is and what are the different cultural mores and the norms. And I think that's brilliant, and I'm sure there's work happening on gossip as we speak somewhere around the world. Thank you.
That
Thank you so much for that. I think every time throughout history we've thought that we are creating oppressive structures. We've also created environments without knowing that, where things thrive. The slavers thought, oh, if we leave the slaves in the plantation and we keep them away from, then they will, but that created the space for music, and that created the space for community. So every time, men create spaces for patriarchy, women find a way to thrive and find a way to create their own worlds within that. Anytime an oppressive government creates, artists find ways to thrive in those environments. So I think, we are not advocating for oppression in any way, but at the same time, we're human being, and to be human is to survive. To be human is to wake up every day and think, how will I survive today?
is there any last question? Because okay, the mic.
I came late, but a brilliant panel. I'm interested in techniques of orality that we can carry to our written work. Do you have any tips? Sort of how can we bring orality to what is printed? Because now that we write, but we still want to have that oral flavor in the written work.
I feel like I'm talking too much.
No.
I'd addressed this earlier when I said I use a lot of orality in my work, so there is techniques like metaphors, there are the ways you carry metaphors and direct translations. If you just carry a phrase or a sentence as it is and you bring it to your text, how does that, replicate that orality? There is use of song within your text. You can have characters break into song or just have lyricism incorporated in your text. And there's just so many ways. Poetry relies on a lot of orality, and in that way, when it's on the page, it's flattened, but when you read it out, then you're still doing that oral storytelling. So yeah, those are the kind of ways that I do.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think the rhythm of the language is very, very important. But I also choose very carefully my words so that I use, where possible, Anglo-Saxon derived words rather than the Latin derived words. That's a formal language, that's the official language, but the vernacular is rooted in Anglo-Saxon. So that, I think, helps a bit, generate or recreate that orality.
I think one of the things I find useful, even in the performance, is if you have a very strong spine, very strong structure of the story, and you're very clear, then even as you meander and you go around, when you return to the spine, the person reading is able to follow through. And in performance or in oral storytelling, what that looks like is the spine often contains a familiar rhythm or refrain or rhyme that tells you you're back on the path. So we went away, okay, we're back. Now we're doing the journey. Oh, look, beautiful trees, the bird. We're walking. So those are techniques that allow you to meander, but also come back to the plot. Because oral storytelling is often very plot driven. You meander to enjoy the view, but at the end of the day, if the story is not going somewhere, then what are you doing? So that's maybe something.
I mean, even something as simple as having your opening line as once upon a time or a long time ago already signifies to the reader that there is some form of orality in the text. So it can be that simple, and it can be as complex as having the entire page having this musicality and having the rhythm in the language.
But just to underscore that, I think documenting oral stories is extremely important, and done with empathy. I think that's pretty much what they're saying, getting the local flavor, throwing in those words, having the language break maybe in the way that when somebody's reading. When I perform what is a lesser known Ramayana called the Kunkana Ramayana, which is half Gujarat, half Maharashtra, written by the tribal belt. It's not even written, it's oral. They document it as recent as a year ago. So for us, as storytellers, it opened a completely new world where Ravan, who's generally called a villain, is born only as a torso. This is my first encounter with a Ravan who has no hands and legs. How did he go to being the 10-headed demon? So I feel it's very important, ma'am, and thank you for that question, to document these things. And I think I'd like to thank my panelists for the kind of work that they're doing. As a performer, as a storyteller, it's very heartwarming to see such lovely work. So thank you, each and every one of you.
And thank you so much for the brilliant moderation.
No, please. I mean, it's been an honor sharing the stage with the three of you. And I hope to connect with you and maybe perform also soon sometimes. Yeah? Good luck. And Mathrubhumi team, and especially our volunteers for running around. Thank you so much for this session as well. Thank you. Thank you. Ma'am, it's over to you.